So today I'm here to talk about the fantasy and science fiction I've been reading recently. I feel like it's been a hot minute since I've done one of these videos. I've been reading a lot of big chunky titles, and today I'm here to talk about some new releases, some 2023 titles that have come out, and this is all in preparation for my final end of the year videos, which will be coming out closer to December, so definitely hang tight and stick around if you want to subscribe. Let's get started with the books. First, let's talk science fiction, starting with These Burning Stars by Bethany Jacobs. This is a book that I received from Orbit for review, and this is the start of a new series. Within the story, we follow this con artist, this thief, who comes across this artifact that possibly implicates this family in this greater plot, and so politics ensue. This is one, as you can tell from the synopsis, is very politically heavy, and I really enjoyed those elements to it. The characters were pretty good, and I did find it to be a relatively interesting take on a future. Just some of the details about the world, the societies, I found to be quite compelling, and just those moments where you're reading something, you're like, oh, that's interesting. So I definitely had a lot of moments reading that. It was an enjoyable read, easy to fall into, very accessible, but also has enough complex appeal for someone like myself who's read a lot of science fiction and are looking for something a little bit more than that surface level read. Overall, I enjoyed this one, but I will admit there's something quite missing from it, where it wasn't quite the memorable read I wanted it to be. A very enjoyable experience. I actually still gave it 4 stars, but even as I record this here, I read the book maybe about 2 weeks ago, and I don't have the strongest impression of it compared to other books that I read years ago that stick with me a lot stronger. That being said, I'm definitely interested in the series and would love to continue on if I get a chance to. Next up, I want to talk Murderbot. So I received a copy of the newest Murderbot book, which is System Collapse, which just came out or is coming out in November from Tor, and this of course is the most recent one. I do recommend, if you're going to go into the series, you do want to start back at the beginning with All Systems Red. The series is just so character heavy that in terms of the plot you can kind of jump in, but there's a lot of building from the previous books at this point, so it's one where you're going to benefit from knowing the characters, knowing the backstory, etc. I've done a whole series review on this Murderbot series, so I do recommend checking that out. This most recent book, I will admit, it was good, but not my favorite in the series. Probably one of my least favorites. I just didn't find the plot that compelling, and really what I enjoyed most about this one was just spending time with the character of Murderbot, which is what I say pretty much about every book in the series. The publisher was also kind to send me a few books just to get caught up, so before reading that I read Network Effect. This of course is the full-length novel, and I gotta say that I do think Murderbot works best in the short form, just because again it's so episodic that I think it works good in those little snapshots. But given the fact that this is a novel, I thought the author did a good job of creating a plot that did feel a little bit more big, a little bit more epic, and I was generally compelled by it. But I don't know if this book needed to be a novel, but I still enjoyed my time with it. As well, I also got a chance to read Fugitive Telemetry, and this is definitely one of my favorites. It has that murder mystery plot to it, which if you don't know, as a science fiction reader, I also love mystery stories. So when the two genres get combined in a story like this, I thought it worked really well. It's a case where I enjoyed, again, the voice of Murderbot, but for me, this is one of the most compelling plots in the whole series, because when someone gets murdered, I enjoy that puzzle. This is a lot of fun, and this is definitely one of my favorites. But again, you start back at the beginning if you haven't yet. You'll get a better experience if you go through the series in chronological order. Next up, I read Generational Ship by Michael Mammy, and this is a story that is set, as you can imagine, on a generational ship. The story is told from multiple perspectives. The beginning events of the story follow one of the scientists on this ship who discover that there is a planet that they are approaching that potentially has the ability to have organic life live on it. It's survivable, or would be a livable place for humans to settle. And so naturally this ship is very excited for this news, and so what we follow afterwards is the consequences and the lead up to them going to the planet. So we follow different perspectives who have different feelings and emotions towards this event, and beyond that there's actually larger things going on. This book deals a lot with generational policy, which I actually thought was a really interesting concept, not something I've directly read before, because the idea is that when the original people came on the ship, they set out certain policies in order to make the ship run. Specifically in this story, it deals a lot with the end of life policy, where people are intended, or expected rather, to end their lives in order to make room and make space and resources for newer members of the families to come into the world. And so naturally they agreed to this when they first start out, but the people who are on the ship now are not the ones who agreed to that all these years ago. And opinion will naturally change over time, and so it's really the question of, should policy change when opinion does, or should that policy stay in place because it was meant to protect the crew and make sure that the resources are available available. So there's a lot of unrest, uncertainty, and you follow again different people and different perspectives. And so you get to see those different opinions and have them contrasted against each other. I thought this book was really interesting. I went into this book honestly with no expectations. I've read one book by this author before, The Misfit Soldiers, which was a fun, rompy military science fiction story, and it was fun, but I don't think it was trying to be anything to the extent of this one. This one just feels like another level. It definitely feels like the author brought their game to a new peak, and I really am impressed by their work. I definitely will read more by them now. The characters were well drawn, diverse, in a very natural way, just complex, morally gray, and you could easily understand or follow their motivations, but they were never, again, like one-sided or stereotypes. There was some great neurodiversity and other different elements within the story. And I love the characters. I love the puzzle of the story. The fact is you could picture yourself as the characters thinking, what would I do if I was on this ship? Would I go along with this? How would you deal with the idea of doing what's best for the ship versus doing what feels morally right to you? Love those conversations, love the ethics and morality and all those conversations surrounding the story. It was really well done. It was just smart. And I think it's a very accessible story, but again, the kind of story that has enough meat behind it for someone like myself who's looking for a more complex, nuanced story is still gonna be really satisfied. If you can't tell, I really enjoyed this one. It's relatively long, but I flew through it. It's one of those experiences where I read this book every moment I could. I was reading a fantastic horror book at the same time, which I'll talk about soon, and I just could not decide which book I wanted to read, so I just was reading both of them nonstop, switching back and forth. And so highly recommend this one. I do feel like it's a little bit less known than some of the other books I'm going to discuss on this list here, but well worth your time. If you share my taste in science fiction, this is a new release you'll want to pick up. Now let's switch gears and talk about fantasy, starting with Bookshops and Bonedust by Travis Baldree. This is a prequel to Legends and Lattes, a booktube darling that just took the internet by storm, I believe last year when it came out. So this is a follow-up, or specifically a prequel book that follows the orc who eventually goes on to run this coffee shop. So here she is still a warrior, and through circumstances she ends up kind of getting stranded in this town and ends up spending her time at this bookshop. The story is just cute. I think with a story like this, it really comes down to expectations. I don't go into stories like this or Legends and Latte expecting it to be a life-changing read. I know a lot of people really found that book to be 5 stars. I found it to be cute and quaint and cozy and a good palate cleanser between a lot of the dark and messed up stories I tend to prefer. So I thought that that one was cute, and I have very similar feelings about this one. Does it really enhance the universe? Does it need to exist as a story? Not necessarily, but I am a sucker for cute stories set in bookshops and all of that. And in my mind, I thought that this one actually worked perhaps a little bit better for me because I felt like there was a little bit more action and setup because, again, it was still during their warrior days. So I actually almost prefer this one, which I think is an unlikely or unpopular opinion. So if you love this series, I would recommend going back to this one. I know other people have given different reviews of this book, but again, I'm only going to speak to my experience. I think it's cozy. Is it going to be a best book of the year for me? Probably not, simply because, again, it's far too cute for my personal taste, but it's doing exactly what it's intended to do, so I can't fault it for that. Next, let's talk about Contrarian, and this is the 3rd book in a series where I have not read the first 2 books, something I do not typically do, but basically the original 2 books were supposed to be sent to me by the publisher. They never showed up, and I decided to go ahead and try out this one anyway. Not my preferred way to do it, but I did want to check this one out because it sounds so interesting. So this is a story that is set in a fantasy gas lamp type setting. The story itself is very politically heavy, focusing on elements surrounding economics and the employment situation of this world. So you talk about individuals that are struggling with their jobs or are underemployed or unemployed, and just all of the economic and social implications surrounding that. So some really interesting political conversations that I don't see normally in fantasy stories. At the center of the story, there is a man and woman who have a relationship, and that is very interesting and key to the story. I really liked their relationship. It's not something I'm looking for in a book, is that kind of romantic piece to it, but I just found it to be very, I wouldn't say pleasing, but I don't mean that in that way. Instead, it was just a very straightforward relationship with two consenting adults in a way that just felt very mature, and I did appreciate as someone who was in kind of a longer term relationship. So I liked it. This is definitely a time again where I enjoyed what I read, but I'm very much aware that there's probably more to the series that I didn't pick up because I was reading this out of order. You kind of just get yourself dropped into the story. So if those books ever show up, I do intend to go back and do a series review and reevaluate this one. But as a book where I didn't entirely know what was going on, I had a pretty good time with it. Great characters, great world, and I wish I knew what was going on in terms of some of the backstory, but they give you enough clues that I was able to follow along, pick it up, but I suspect there's more of the story that I could have gleaned if I, again, read in chronological order as is intended. Next, we have Blade of Dream by Daniel Abraham, and if you follow my channel, you might know that the first book in this series, Age of Ash, made my favorite backlist titles for fantasy, so naturally I was excited to continue on with the newest release, which came out in July. Orbit sent me an audio version for review. I definitely wish that I'd had a physical version just to be able to compare and contrast with, because sometimes I do like to physically read a book, or I do prefer it often when it comes to fantasy, but I was so anxious that I did decide to continue on and read this book in any form they would send. And so this is technically a companion novel to the first book. If you've read the first book, you're aware that it can definitely be read as a standalone. It's a bit of a complete story, and so I was kind of curious where they would go with this one. This one, without giving away too much, follows a different perspective, a different character. Eventually it links in with the first book, but honestly in a way that I find you can really just read the story by itself. I will admit I was less interested in the story in our main character. Instead, what really held my attention with this book, personally, I love fantasy stories that are set in an urban setting but still in a secondary world. So not urban fantasy as we like to call it, but in an epic fantasy world but still set in a city. And that's what you get here. So the city is very much a character within the story, and there's a lot of conversations about the cultural aspects or social aspects of this world. Particularly the second book really focused on the idea of different religions and the respect for different religions, and so you don't have certain religions where are taking precedent over other ones, but instead by respecting all religions, everyone is just a little bit religious and has their preferences. But it's a really interesting conversation that's kind of a thread throughout the story, and those details I actually found more interesting than the story itself. So I like this one, but I will admit it may not make my favorites of the year. I don't think it left as strong as impression on me as the first book. I still really like the author's writing. I'm still interested in the backlist, and if another book comes out in this series next year, I would happily read it. I also got a chance to read the Jasad Heir, and this is another Orbit book that was sent via audio. And so I got to listen to this epic-inspired fantasy series that is inspired particularly by Egyptian culture. And as I mentioned, I got to the audiobook. It is very rich, great narration, but as always with epic fantasy, I wish I was able to go back and forth with the physical book. But I really enjoyed the world building within the story. The basic setup is it is set in a world where magic has become banned. They have killed off the family, the royal family that used to do magic, and so they believe that is all behind them. However, possibly one person survived, and we follow that individual in the story. In terms of fantasy, this one is very tropey. It leans into a lot of stories that I've seen told again and again in different ways. The Egyptian background and world makes it a little bit more interesting or unique in that regard. But this is one that I had a really good time reading it in terms of it was easy to fly through. It was accessible and an intriguing story and moved along very well. But again, it's one of those stories where I had a good time reading it, but it didn't necessarily leave me with the most lasting impression. It's not the kind of story that I'm thinking about after finishing the same way I do with other ones. Again, it's sort of a series. If it continues on, I will continue on with it because I liked it enough. I like the characters. It was just kind of a comforting read because it was so tropey, and I'm just hoping that it does something a little bit more unique and really grabs my attention in the future books. But it's got good potential, so I'm here to see where it goes from here. And finally, I want to mention Guild of Magic by John Auerbach, and this is the second book in the series that I talked about many years ago on my channel. The first book is Guild of Tokens, and it's one I've recommended before. Now, this is a piece of urban fantasy where it is set in our world, and we follow a programmer who starts to discover that there is this underlying culture, this organization that is dropping and leaving tokens in exchange for little tasks around their city. And so in the first book, we're following them as they're discovering this and slowly collecting the tokens. And the second book picks up from there and really expands the world. I, like a lot of readers, really enjoy progression fantasy. And this is one that I just don't see talked about enough. In my opinion, it's actually one of my favorites. I find it to be a very compelling universe. I just love the idea that it is a story that is set in our world, and it really takes the concept of what is often like lit RPG, where you have a character who has to go and perform a task and then they get a reward for it. It takes that concept, but it says, what if that situation was happening in real life? And it's just a very compelling story where I could easily put myself in the place of that main character. And if you got the opportunity to go down this rabbit hole and see where it leads and see what this world holds, how could you say no to that? So I find it just a very compelling story. I ripped through the second book incredibly fast, and so I do recommend it if you're looking for more underhyped progression fantasy, one that I don't see talked about online, at least in my circles. This is one I'd recommend. I had a great time reading it, and I definitely hope there's another book coming because I definitely want more. So that's it for this video here. I'd love to know what the books I talked about. Are there any that you're planning on checking out for yourself? And please recommend me any last minute 2023 releases that you want me to get to before I finalize my best of the year list. It's been a great year so far for science fiction fantasy, and I can't wait to talk about my favorites all very soon. If you enjoy my channel and want to stick around, I do read science fiction fantasy and other dark things, and you can help me out with subscribing, hitting that little notification bell, hitting that thumbs up, and dropping a comment, even if it's just a spaceship or a dragon. It lets me know you're here and lets YouTube know that you're participating in the video. So if you want to stick around and subscribe, appreciate it. Let's talk again soon. Okay, bye.